with Mana Rocks, and we're going to go ahead and start reviewing Theros Beyond Death, a set that I am extremely excited for. If you don't already know, Theros is the set I started playing Magic in, so getting to return to Theros, 6, 7, 8 years later, it's pretty exciting for me to kind of come back to the characters I started playing Magic with. You'll notice a couple things. First off, I haven't been super active on the channel in a while, and part of that is because Eldraine just kind of lost my interest, and it's just been around forever. Also, the holiday seasons have kind of wrapped up, and I've been very busy lately, so I haven't posted too much on the channel, but we're hopefully going to go ahead and make a swing back with Theros here. And I figured I would tackle reviews a little bit differently this time. To be honest, like doing a full review of every single card in the set, it's time consuming, and it just doesn't really capture people's interest, right? Not that any of my videos are ever like reaching thousands of views or anything, but I just noticed there wasn't a lot of interest in watching 45-minute long video about every single card in a certain color and then doing that 5 to 6 times per set. It just didn't, the juice wasn't really worth the squeeze on that one. So what we're going to do this time around is take Theros Beyond Death and break it up into archetypes and just go over 2 archetypes per video. And hopefully this will be a little bit more bite-sized for people who are just trying to get an idea of what the set is trying to make you actively draft or played when it comes to limited. And that's how we're going to approach things. So we're going to start off by looking at the blue color pairs, blue-black and blue-red in Theros Beyond Death. And thankfully, Theros is a very standard limited set in that it's basically broken down into 2 color archetypes, and each archetype kind of has a little bit of a different theme going on. There's going to be some overlap with some of those themes, and there's going to be some sets, or rather some archetypes that are completely different, and I figured we would just go ahead and pick up 2 blue ones and start off with that. So the way I'm going to break this down is I'm going to choose one of the color pairs. I'm going to go ahead and tell you the basic theme of that color pair, and then we'll go into some cards. We'll talk about the payoff cards, the reason you want to be in that archetype, and we'll talk about the kind of enablers or the synergy cards that make that archetype really tick, you know, the meat and potatoes, the bread and butter of that limited archetype. And then we'll talk about the rares that really make that archetype tip. Honestly, the rares that if you pick them up, they are going to make that archetype work, or they just happen to be in that color combination and they don't really work outside of it. So that's the game plan here. You can let me know in the comments below if you like this sort of structure to the limited reviews. I've tinkered with my reviews a lot of different ways, and I'm just still trying to settle on a way that I enjoy doing it that's helpful for other people. So feedback is very much welcome in the comments. You can also find us on Twitter at MTG_Mana Rocks and let us know how you feel there. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into our first color pair for Theros, and that's going to be blue-black, which has a self-mill theme. You'll notice I'm not going over the mechanics in depth here, but one of the big mechanics for Theros is escape, which is basically a variant of flashback or retrace where you can exile cards out of your graveyard to cast an escape card from your graveyard. And with that being said, you'll see a lot of archetypes that kind of overlap into this graveyard territory where you want to fill up your graveyard and then cast things from your graveyard using the escape mechanic. So blue-black is probably the most defined archetype as far as the graveyard strategy goes, and your game plan's a little bit flexible, right? Basically, you want to mill yourself, and you want to find good escape cards that you can reuse over and over again and just outvalue your opponent. You also have this backup plan of trying to mill the opponent out, but I would be a little bit cautious about milling your opponent in this format because escape crosses every single color, and you might actually be benefiting your opponent when you mill them. So if you're trying to mill your opponent out, you need to make sure you're all in on that strategy and you actually have the cards to do so. But let's go ahead and talk about our payoff cards here. Again, these are the cards that when you pick them up, they are what you're looking for. They're the main reasons to be in this color. Maybe not necessarily the strongest cards in the color combination, but they're the reasons to be in the color and the things that you're hoping to get hooked up with when you do end up with this color combination. I figured for this section, I would start off each one by looking at the gold uncommon, because for the most part, they're pretty good at telling you what that color combination should do. So our first card here is Devourer of Memory. It's blue-black for a 2/1. It's an uncommon, and it says whenever one or more cards are put into your graveyard from your library, Devourer of Memories gets +1/+1 until end of turn and can't be blocked this turn. On top of that, you can pay 1 blue and a black to put the top card of your library into your graveyard. So you kind of see the payoff and the enabler all in one here. You're very obviously just paid off for milling cards. Now, one thing to note here is that if you mill a chunk of cards, let's say you cast something on yourself that says mill 4 cards, that's all going to happen at once, and Devourer of Memory will not get +1/+1 for each card milled, only each instance of milling cards. So if you just mill yourself for 4, you're only getting +1/+1, but if you, say, activate this ability on this creature twice, that's 2 different instances, so this will get +1/+1 twice and become a 4/3 unblockable. Pretty sweet card, right? By itself, it's decent, right? You can pay 3 mana to make it a 3/2 unblockable, and that's a real clock. That is a strong card. You can activate it multiple times to make it even bigger in the late game. It enables your graveyard synergies by just putting cards into your graveyard, which we'll see there is a lot of in this set, and it pays you off for doing it as well. So a pretty marquee uncommon, and basically the headliner for what you're trying to do in this archetype. We also have Pharika's Spawn, and this is kind of a filler for all of the good escape cards that are in the set. Sure, there are some pretty bad escape cards, but Pharika's Spawn is one of the pinnacle cards when it comes to escape mechanic because it is super strong. So let's read the card real quick. It's 3 and a black for a 3/4 uncommon. So, baseline 3/4 for 4 is a decent card, not something you're clamoring over, but obviously it has upside, right? First off, it has escape for 5 and a black. So for 6 mana, you can exile 3 other cards from your graveyard and cast this card from the graveyard. So 4 mana to cast it from your hand, 6 mana, and 3 cards from your graveyard to cast it from the graveyard. And there's a rider here that it escapes with 2 +1/+1 counters on it, and when it enters the battlefield this way, each opponent sacrifices a non-Gorgon creature. Don't get caught up too much in that non-Gorgon part. There's only like 3-4-ish Gorgons in this set, so not too big of a deal there. But basically, you've got an alright vanilla creature that in the late game is going to come back as a 5/6 that makes your opponent sack a creature. And making your opponent sack a creature isn't a huge deal in Limited because they're always just going to sack their worst creature. They might have tokens, yada yada yada. But sometimes this is just great, and a 5/6 that makes your opponent lose something, even if it's not always their best card, is decent. And the escape cost is pretty cheap. Or rather, the number of cards you exile is pretty cheap. 6 mana is a lot, but being able to exile 3 cards rather than some of the escape costs, which cost 4, 5, or 6, that's pretty cheap as far as escape's going to go here. So obviously, this is kind of one of the better escape creatures you can have in blue-black, but you'll find a bunch of others. I'm not going to list every single one here, but Pharika's Spawn is the type of card that when you pick it up early, you might look to go into blue-black, and you'll see this card again on some of the other lists, especially green-black, which overlaps a lot with this archetype. As far as spells go, I wanted to mention 2 here. In fact, I'll go ahead and pull the other one up. There's Glimpse of Freedom. This is 1 and a blue for an uncommon instant, and the text is simple: draw a card. It also has escape for 2 and a blue, and you have to exile 5 other cards from your graveyard, which is a lot. But basically, this is a repeatable way to draw cards, and it lets you use your graveyard as kind of a way to turn that into card advantage, right? 5 cards is a lot more than it sounds like. You might be able to escape this twice at most, maybe 3 times in an entire game. And keep in mind that escape cards are kind of, they're going to provide tension with one another. Think of Delve, right? If you played Khans of Tarkir, you can only have so many Delve cards in your deck, the same way you can only have so many escape cards in your deck if you need to escape them for them to be good, right? Glimpse of Freedom is not a great card on its own, but if you run it alongside 4 or 5 other escape cards that also have really high exorbitant exile costs on them, it's not going to pan out. But if you only have a couple escape cards in your deck, Glimpse of Freedom is a great one to have, and you'll see with these escape cards, just milling them incidentally with your blue-black self-mill cards is nice, because then you get this free draw spell later on in the game, and it doesn't cost too much mana to activate it. Cling to Dust is a single black mana for an instant as well, also an uncommon instant, and this one's a little more complicated. It says exile a target card from any graveyard, and if it was a creature, you gain 3 life. If it was not a creature, you draw a card. So similar to Glimpse of Freedom, you can basically use this as repeated card draw or repeated life gain, which isn't as big of a deal. But being able to use this as repeated card draw is nice. Now, this one also lets you exile 5 other cards from your graveyard, but the escape cost is a little more expensive. It's 3 and a black. So if you are looking for a draw engine to take advantage of all of your self-mill, then these are probably the 2 best cards to do so outside of the rare rarity or mythic rare. And I think they do a pretty good job. They are uncommon for a reason, right? They seem pretty weak as uncommons, but when you consider the fact that these can draw you 3 to 4 extra cards during the span of a game, I think it makes sense that they're uncommon. All right, so your enablers, your synergy cards, again, these are the meat and potatoes of your limited decks. These aren't cards that really pay you off for being in the strategy, but they help the strategy tick when you have the payoffs. The first one, and you'll see this card a couple times throughout the course of this series, is Shoal Kraken. It's 4 and a blue for a 3/5. Again, an uncommon. It's a Kraken, and it has Constellation, which is basically landfall for enchantments. It says whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. So I could have mentioned basically any of the looters in this set, and there's a decent number of them, but this is just a way to cycle through your deck. It does require you to have enchantments, but that's just going to naturally happen in this set because there is a absolute boatload of enchantments. A lot of creatures in this set are enchantments as well. I should mention in regards to Constellation that when Journey into Nyx came out and the Constellation mechanic was released, every single instance of Constellation was on an enchantment creature, and that is not the case in this set. In fact, most cards with Constellation are not enchantments themselves, so they will not trigger themselves, which we're used to with the Journey into Nyx cards. You will actually have to have other enchantments on top of these cards. So this will not trigger itself when it enters the battlefield, but being able to play an enchantment and just loot lets you really shape up your hand, and as far as this strategy is concerned, lets you shape up your graveyard as well. Not too hard to draw a card and then discard an escape card, and then basically it's almost like you just drew a card, not even looted. So not a premium card, maybe it is, who knows, but an enabler for the format, or rather for the archetype, definitely. Towering Wave Mystic. This is 1 and a blue for a 2/1. It's a common, it's a Merfolk Wizard, and it says when it deals damage, target player puts that many cards from the top of their library into their graveyard. So basically, this is going to trade off for an opponent's creature and put 2 cards from your graveyard, or rather from your deck, into your graveyard. You will want to target yourself with this. Also note that it's damage, not combat damage. So if somehow this ends up brawling in a fight with other creatures, you get the trigger as well. And if this goes unblocked, it can be a really good enabler, right? If you somehow give this flying or make it unblockable, this can repeatedly mill yourself and fill up your graveyard. Again, I don't think you want to mill your opponent. That's a mistake I think a lot of people are going to make in this format early on, is they're going to trade off the Tower and Wave Mystic. They're going to target their opponent because that's generally what you would do with a card like this, and you're going to mill them into a good escape spell and basically give them free value. So if you're playing Tower and Wave Mystic and you don't just want a bear in your deck, you should be targeting yourself. Almost every single deck I can imagine in this format is going to have some sort of escape card in it because there's so much of it floating around. Mire Triton is a much better card. This is one of the probably premium 2-drops in the format outside of rare. It is a 1 and a black for a 2/1 zombie merfolk. It has Death Touch, which is already great. 2 mana, 2/1 Death Touch is a good card. And when it enters the battlefield, you put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard, and you gain 2 life. So you have life gain, you have self-mill, and you've got a Death Touch and Body all on 1 card. So this is a really awesome package. The life gain is just, gravy on top of a card you'd be playing anyway. Honestly, this didn't even need the whole second paragraph, and it would be a card that you would play basically every single time. But add in that extra paragraph on there where you get the 2 cards into your graveyard and you gain a little bit of life back on top of being a creature that's just going to trade for something from your opponent, whether it's a removal spell or whether it's, a creature of their own. This is just a nice little package and probably one of the premium uncommon creatures in this set, at least outside of the gold cards that we're going to see. We have Sage of Mysteries. This is a single blue mana for a 0/2, also an uncommon. It's a human wizard, and it has Constellation. Again, this is not an enchantment, but it needs other enchantments to trigger. And the constellation trigger is target player puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard. So if your deck is chock full of enchantments, this might be one of those alternate win cons I was talking about where you can mill your opponent out. But this is just a way, again, similar to the Shoal Kraken, to just repeatedly put cards into your graveyard and hopefully mill yourself. If you have cards like the Devourer on board, the gold uncommon that we just saw, this is a great way to just make sure that's unblockable every turn while still adding to your board, right? And a lot of the Constellation cards do that. They let you build your board out while also getting these triggers that enable your strategy. And I believe the last card I wanted to talk about in this category is Sweet Oblivion. It's 1 in a blue, also an uncommon. It's a sorcery. It says target player mills 4 cards. This one has escape for 3 in a blue, and you also exile 4 cards from your graveyard. So this is a neat little way to fill up your own graveyard. I think this is probably one of the worst ways to do it. And the reason I included it on this list is because this can be a backup plan to try and mill your opponent out. This is basically a repeatable way to mill your opponent. It's not inconceivable that you can cast this card and then maybe escape it twice throughout the course of a game, maybe even 3 times, and mill your opponent for 12 to 16 cards. And if you happen to be against an opponent who's aggressively milling themselves out, Sweet Oblivion can be a way to punish them by just finishing the job and making sure they mill completely out. Again, I think this card is designed with self-mill in mind, and I think it's a little bit weaker than a lot of the creatures that are just going to naturally fill up your graveyard, but it is a secondary game plan in case you don't really draft a deck that has a lot of payoffs for these enablers, so just keep it in mind. I don't think it's going to be something you want to include your deck often, but it could be a good sideboard strategy against this type of deck. All right, and we'll talk about the rares here. Again, I'm not going to talk about every single rare in blue-black, but I'm going to talk about a lot for this archetype specifically, and I'm going to try to talk about the rares that are probably at their best in this archetype, so you won't see me really talking about, like, Erebos here, even though it's a bomb for this deck, obviously, because, you know, it's just going to be good in every single black deck. I want to talk about the cards that have specifically synergy with the deck itself. So the first one here is Gravebreaker Lamia. I don't know. It's 4 and a black for a 4/4. It is an enchantment creature, and it has a lifelink. Okay, 5 mana, 4/4 lifelink. It's already a pretty good start. When it enters the battlefield, you can search your library for any card and put it into your graveyard. So we call that entombing. You can entomb any card from your graveyard, or rather from your library, and just throw it into the graveyard. And spells you cast from your graveyard cost 1 less to cast. So this is a great enabler for this format. It goes and fetches out your best escape card and just throws it into the graveyard. Plus it makes it cheaper to cast. It's an enchantment for your constellation cards. And it's a beater on top of that, a 5 mana 4/4 lifelinker. So obviously a card that you're very happy to first pick. I can't imagine you're passing this over basically any common or uncommon in the set. And it bridges the gap between a lot of different archetypes. You'll see this card again when we come to white-black, you'll see when we come to green-black. It's just all around a solid card for graveyard-based strategies. Eat to Extinction. Not a lot to talk about here. It's 3 and a black for an instant. It's a rare. It says exile target creature or planeswalker. Look at the top card of your library. You may put that card into your graveyard. So whatever, right? It's just probably the best, if not one of the best removal spells that you can ask for. You should be first picking it. It's just unconditional removal for anything you can possibly want to deal with, even a planeswalker, right? And on top of that, you get to mill yourself for 1. That's the reason I include it on this list. Obviously, it's going to be good in any black deck and very splashable outside of black decks, but that extra mill a card on top of it is just a nice little bit of gravy that actually matters in a set like this. Thassa's Oracle. This card's a little bit complicated, but I'll try to break it down. It's blue for a 1/3. It's a rare, and it says when it enters the battlefield, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is your devotion to blue. That's how many blue mana symbols you have in the permanents you control. You get to put 1 of them on top of your library. The rest go to the bottom randomly. And here's the rider. If X is greater than or equal to the number of cards in your library, you win the game. So basically what this says is you get to set up your next card out of the top X cards of your library. X is your devotion to blue. But if your devotion to blue is equal to or greater than the number of cards you have in your library, you just win the game. So the reason I include this in this archetype is pretty straightforward, right? If you're planning on milling yourself out or at least self-milling yourself into oblivion, and you end up with, I don't know, like 10 to 15 cards left, then I could see Thassa's Oracle be in your game plan, right? You just aggressively mill yourself, try to get yourself down to basically nothing, and then Thassa's Oracle can finish the job. If you have 2 cards left in your library, Thassa's Oracle says, enter the battlefield, win the game, right? Which is pretty crazy if you think about it. It punishes opponents for trying to mill you out as well. So if your opponent's milling you out, then Thassa's Oracle is probably a card you want to keep in your hand until the last moment, and it can just win you the game for basically nothing. I imagine there are going to be some games won with this card that you have no business winning. I don't think you even have to go super heavy on the devotion to blue here, because if you plan to mill yourself out, you can do it very aggressively in this set, and it's not too hard to get yourself down to 0 cards, in which case Thassa's Oracle doesn't care what your devotion to blue is. On top of that, if you happen to have other blue pips on the permanents you control, then that means you have to do a lot less self-milling, and that can help too. So kind of a neat card. I'm not sure that you should be first picking a Thassa's Oracle yet. I'm not sure how good it actually is, but it is a sweet little card for this sort of archetype. Ephemia, the Cacophony, is 1 and a black for a 2/1. It is a legendary enchantment creature. It is a harpy, it's a rare, and it's a flyer, so 2 mana, 2/1 flyer. At the beginning of your we'll try that again. At the beginning of your end step, you may exile an enchantment card from your graveyard, and if you do, you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. So this is a way to turn milling enchantments into extra bodies on board, and it seems solid, right? You'll probably just have a bunch of enchantments coincidentally because there are so many of them in this set. A lot of the creatures in the set just happen to be enchantments, so you don't really need to push yourself to play bad enchantments because you're just going to have good cards that happen to be enchantments. And Ephemia can turn your self-mill into extra zombies. I think this is another card similar to the Lamia that it's just fine to first pick this. Maybe not one of the biggest bombs in the set or anything like that, but it's a fine early pick that bridges the gap between a bunch of different archetypes, and it pays you off for just putting cards into your graveyard. Woe Strider, we'll see this card again in a couple archetypes. It's 2 and a black for a 3/2. It's a rare horror, and when it enters the battlefield, you make a 0/1 white goat creature token. For some reason, I don't understand the flavor of it, but there's a goat there. This is a free sack outlet. It just says sacrifice another creature, scry 1. You can't sack other creatures, or rather, you can't sack itself, but you can sack anything else to scry 1, and this just gives you free sack outlet, which we don't really see that ever anymore. And that's a lot more powerful than it seems, right? Just to be able to fizzle removal spells and things like that. On top of that, it escapes with 2+1/+1 counters on it, and the escape cost is 3 black, and exile 4 other cards from your graveyard. So you get a 3 mana 3/2 that comes with a additional goat attached to it. Whatever you want to do with that goat is fine. You can sack creatures to scry, and if it ever dies or you mill over it, you can just bring it back for a pretty reasonable cost as a 5/4. And exile 4 cards from your graveyard. This seems very strong to me and a card I'm happy to first pick. Again, this fits in the red-black sacrifice deck. It fits into the green-black escape deck. It fits into this blue-black self-mill deck. It's just a card that's easy to first pick, very strong as a standalone card, even better than something like, say, Ephemia, which needs a little bit of work to be a very strong card. And this is just a self-sufficient good card. So I'd be happy to first pick a Woe Strider and try to move into blue-black if I see that direction being open. Atris, Oracle of Half-Truths, is 2 blue and a black for a 3/2 Human Advisor. It's a legendary, it's rare, and it has Menace, so 4 mana, 3/2 Menace. Okay, that's a fine card. Not really something that blue-black normally sees, but you really want the ETB here. When Atris enters the battlefield, target opponent looks at the top 3 cards of your library, separates them into a face-down pile and a face-up pile, and you put one of the piles into your hand and the other into your graveyard. So worst case scenario, this is going to draw you 2 cards. Even if it draws you 2 lands or your opponent plays some sort of mind tricks, we're not really going to get into the nuance of that. You'll just have to determine based on how the game's going which pile you want. Note that one of them is face down, so you don't really know what you're getting out of that pile. But if your opponent puts good cards face up, usually just take the good pile or the face up pile. Atris is awesome. It lets you fill up your graveyard. It basically fits the theme of blue-black without trying super hard because it puts cards in the graveyard, but it's also just a self-contained card advantage creature, and I love that about it. So pretty easy first pick, I think, even though it's 2 colors. Not a bomb rare, but card advantage tacked on to an already reasonable body seems good to me, and I'd be pretty happy to have one of these. Timurent Calls the Dead, another card we'll see a couple other times in these videos. It's 2 and a black for a saga. So remember, when a saga comes down, it enters with a chapter counter or war counter or whatever, and you get to trigger the first chapter right away. And then after you draw, you get to trigger the next chapter in a line. So when you play this, you trigger chapter 1, which says put the top 3 cards of your library into your graveyard. Then you may exile a creature or enchantment. If you do, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. And then chapter 2, which happens the turn after you play this, is the same exact thing. So if you manage to get both triggers off, you exile a creature or an enchantment from your graveyard, which you are playing blue-black, so that should be pretty easy to do. This is 3 mana for 2/2 zombies, 3 mana for 4 power and 4 toughness worth of stats. Already pretty good. There's an extra little bonus. Chapter 3 says you gain X life and scry X, where X is the number of zombies you control. And keep in mind that when a saga is finished, when the last chapter goes off, you sacrifice the saga. So this will end up going to the graveyard, which can add to some of your other synergies. So overall, again, not like the most powerful thing in the world. The last chapter doesn't drain your opponent. They don't lose life. You just get an extra little scry and a little bit of a life bonus off of it. So that's pretty nice. But overall, you're looking at chapter 1 and 2, and you want to make sure that you're getting those creature tokens off of it. If you do, I think this is a pretty solid card, and a card that I'd be pretty happy to first pick. And I wanted to talk about Ashiok, but I'm not going to dwell on it because Ashiok doesn't really fit the archetype here very much. It's not really a self-mill card. It's more of a mill your opponent out card, but it's also just kind of a busted 5-mana planeswalker in the vein of something like Obnixilis Reignited or Jace Unraveler of Secrets. You're pretty standard, like 5 mana, 5 loyalty, +1, make a dude, -3, kill a dude, right? So I'm not even going to read the card. Just know that if you pull Ashiok, you don't necessarily have to go into this blue-black self-mill theme because Ashiok doesn't really care about all that. It basically just says protect Ashiok and you're going to win the game. You can use it to mill your opponent out, but honestly, you're probably winning the game anyway if you get to ++++++, and then -7 and your opponent dies. So again, if you pick up Ashiok, don't feel shoehorned into this self-mill deck unless you stay blue-black because Ashiok is perfectly splashable in other decks, and they're just going to be a good card. So again, just very solid. Don't worry about the self-mill thing going on and just win with your Ashiok. Alright, and that moves us into the second archetype for this video. This is the blue-red, I guess I'm calling it the flash deck, right? Basically, it cares about casting at least one spell on your opponent's turn. So you're going to see a lot of instants, you're going to see creatures with flash, you're going to see activated abilities which take advantage of things if your opponent doesn't play into a counter spell. And there are going to be some payoff cards that care about the first spell you cast each turn during your opponent's turn. So let's look at the payoffs here, starting with the gold uncommon. Mischievous Chimera is blue and red, so 2 mana for a 2/2 enchantment creature. It's a flying chimera. 2 mana, 2/2 flyer, pretty solid. It says whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turn, it deals 1 damage to each opponent, scry 1. So worth noting that this isn't going to trigger every time you cast a spell during your opponent's turn. It's only the first spell you cast during your opponent's turn. So basically, when you're in this deck, you're trying to make sure you get these payoffs on board, and then you're trying to make sure that you're using your spells on your opponent's turn by drafting a bunch of instants or things that you can do on their turn rather than playing at sorcery speed. Mischievous Chimera isn't like a huge payoff, and you'll see a lot of these aren't. They're just incremental payoffs, but 1 damage to your opponent and scrying 1 tacked on to something you presumably wanted to cast on your opponent's turn anyway. That's a nice little bonus on top of a creature that's already a very self-sufficient body. So Mischievous Chimera, not something I'm looking to really first pick and move all in on blue-red, but a card that I'm very happy to pick up once I'm in the archetype. Arena Trickster is kind of your bread and butter common payoff card, not the most busted card you can get for the deck, but something that pays you off for being in the strategy. It's 3 and a red for a 3/3. It's a common human shaman, and it says whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Arena Trickster. you need to be basically all in on this strategy for this card to be good. As a 4-mana 3/3, it's not fantastic, but once it gets the first counter and sometimes the second counter, it actually starts to become pretty good. Doesn't have any keywords or anything like that, so it's not really the first in line here. In fact, it's probably the worst of the payoffs you can get. As you'll see, some of them are pretty good here. But if you're looking for things to make the strategy tick, then Arena Trickster is here to kind of help with that job. Dreamstalker Manticore is 2 and a red for an uncommon. It's a 4/2 enchantment creature. It's a mana core. And it says whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turn, it deals 1 damage to any target. So the Chimera just dinged your opponent for 1 and gave you a scry. This actually lets you ping the opponent's creatures or just ping their face anyway. This is a little bit awkward because you can't actually trigger this ability more than once per turn. So you can't take out anything that isn't just a 1 toughness creature. If you can't take a creature out with it, then you probably just ping your opponent, but it's fine too. If you can somehow give this card Death Touch, which I think there might be 1 or 2 ways in the format to do it, then Dreamstalker Manticore actually becomes insane because it just lets you kill creatures at least once per opponent's turn. But I do think it's fine. A 3-mana 4/2 is already a fine card. There's no drawback to it. It is an enchantment if Constellation ends up mattering for your deck. And 1 damage to any target can add up, right? It adds damage similar to the Chimera to your opponent on an already efficient body. So not too much to complain about there. Stinging Lionfish, this is probably your best uncommon payoff. This card is just great. It's 1 in a blue for a 2/1. It's an uncommon enchantment creature fish, and it says whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turn, you may tap or untap target non-land permanent. So you have a conditional tapper, but that is a very strong ability. Being able to tap your opponent's creatures is very nice. So Stinging Lionfish, while already being a bear, or rather a bearfish, if you will, it gives you this kind of flexibility to either untap your permanents and take advantage of tap abilities or give you extra mana, blah, 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 or you can just use it defensively and keep your opponent's best creature tapped down. Keep in mind, again, I feel like I have to say this with cards like this, you can only trigger this once per turn because it only checks on the first spell you cast on your opponent's turn, so you can't really like turbo tap down a bunch of creatures, but you can just keep 1 creature kind of locked down as long as you're able to keep spells that you're casting on your opponent's turn. The enablers, we're going to look at a couple cards here. First off, we have Naiad of Hidden Coves. It's 2 and a blue for a 2/3. It's a common enchantment creature. It's a nymph, and it says as long as it's not your turn, spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. This is already a fine playable card as just a regular blue card in basically any deck that has cards worth casting on the opponent's turn. It makes counter spells better. It makes instant speed draw spells better. It makes flash creatures better. But in this deck in particular, it enables you very, very nicely to sometimes be able to cast one of your payoffs. We saw most of the payoffs are pretty cheap, right? There's 2 2-mana creatures, a 3-mana creature, and a 4-mana creature, so that's pretty cheap. And then being able to cast cheap spells on the opponent's turn is the real trick there. And Knight of the Hidden Coves helps enable that. Again, not a super busted card or anything, but a very good enabler for this strategy. Vexing Gull is kind of a stand-in. I just like the art on this. He's really malicious looking bird for some reason, but it's just simple card. It's 2 and a blue for a 2/2 with flash and flying. So a Windrake with flash, which would already be a card that you're probably interested in playing. Nothing wrong with it, nothing super exciting, but flash creatures matter a lot in this archetype because they give you a way of building out your board while also making sure you're triggering the abilities that matter in that first section we looked at. So it doesn't have to be necessarily Vexing Gull, but you'll see a bunch of flash creatures in this set, and I do advise you to look those up before you go to a pre-release so you're not accidentally just attacking into random flash creatures, because there's a bunch of them in the set. Same thing goes for counter spells here. There's at least, I believe, 3 counter spells at common. One is 3 mana to counter a creature enchantment. One of them is Memory Drain here, which is 2 and a blue to counter a spell and scry 2. And then there's another one that I'm kind of blanking on right now. But all the counter spells are just going to be a little bit better in this archetype than they are in most of the other archetypes. That still doesn't mean something like Memory Drain, a 4 mana counter spell, is like the nuts or anything like that. But your counter spells do get a lot better when they start triggering the abilities of your other creatures, so just keep that in mind when you're playing with and against this archetype, that counter spells do get a little bit of extra value. And let's go ahead and talk about rares for the archetype. Again, these are rares that aren't just necessarily generically good, even though some of them are, but ones that really shine in this archetype and make you want to move into this archetype. The first one is Ashiok's Erasure. This is a fancy rare counter spell, but it's 2 blue. It's a flash enchantment, flash being the real important part here. It says when it enters the battlefield, exile target spell. So note that's not the same as countering a spell. It just takes that spell off of the stack and puts it into exile. Your opponent can't cast spells with the same name as the exiled card. Probably not super relevant for limited, but it could matter. And it says whenever Ashiok's Erasure leaves the battlefield, return the exiled card to its owner's hand. So your opponent doesn't immediately get to cast it like you would with something like, I don't know, Spell Queller, but they do get it back to their hand, which means that they can cast it later on. So kind of like a remand type effect. They do have to kill the Ashiok's Erasure for that to matter. If they don't have a way to do that, then this is basically just a 4-mana counter spell that lets you enable your blue-red strategy by just keeping it up on your opponent's turn, ganking an opponent's spell, triggering your creatures. Not too far off from any of the counter spells that we've already seen or any other ones that are floating around the set, but a card that gets a little bit better in blue-red than it would be in, say, blue-black or any other blue archetype. Thassa's Intervention, this is here basically just on account of being a blue instant that has a decent effect. It's X blue for a rare instant, and it lets you choose one. Either look at the top X cards of your library, put 2 of them into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library randomly, or counter target spell unless its controller pays twice X. So you pay blue X and target a spell. Your opponent has to pay 2 mana. If you play blue XX or blue 2, your opponent has to pay 4 mana, so on and so forth. A lot of times you'll just use the first half of this since it is card advantage. And I said this already, but basically any playable instant, especially instant speed card draw or counter spells, are going to be good in this archetype. And Thassa's Intervention is a split card between those. It's either a draw spell or a counter spell, whichever one you need. Theros, the Sudden Storm, seems like a bomb rare to me, and while it's a card that you'll play in every single blue deck and you'll first pick it very happily, it's going to be absolutely bonkers in the blue-red deck. It's 3 blue for a 4/5. It's a legendary elemental giant at rare. It has flash, ding ding, flash. It has flying on a 5-mana 4/5, and it says spells you cast with converted mana cost 5 or greater cost 1 less to cast and can't be countered. So very good at stopping opposing counter spells while also just making expensive cards cheaper. We don't care so much about that last line because that's going to matter sometimes, but not really the driving force of the card when it comes to limited. What we care about is that this is just an overcosted, or rather overstatted flyer with flash, which is kind of bonkers. This is the type of card that's just going to ruin people's days by flashing it in, eating an attacker, and then it's just going to be jamming back. Theros is very, very strong. You should be first picking it, and you don't necessarily have to be in blue-red for this card to be as bonkers as it is, but if you can pick up those blue-red archetypal staples and then have giant flash creatures on top of it, I think your deck's going to come together very well. Thassa, Deep Dwellin, is worth mentioning here. Again, Thassa is a card that might be worth playing in blue decks. It's actually one of the weaker gods when it comes to this set. It needs a little bit of a build-around material, but the main point here is that it has the activated ability of 3 and a blue to tap another target creature. And the reason I'm including that here is, yes, that's not casting a spell on your opponent's turn, but sometimes this deck is going to want to hold up counter spells, and your opponent's just not going to play into it. They're not going to cast a spell. So having mana sinks that let you do something else with your mana is very relevant for an archetype like this, which needs to be cast in spells in order for it to really get paid off for what it's trying to do. If your opponent plays around that, being able to use a mana sink to get around that is also nice. And Thassa has extra text on it. Again, I'm not here to talk about the god text and how often this is going to be a creature and so on and so forth, but it is a relevant rare with a relevant activated ability that lets you use your mana if your opponent plays around what you're trying to do with this deck. Wavebreak Hippocamp, this is the type of rare that makes you want to move into this archetype specifically. It's 2 and a blue for a 2/2. It is a rare enchantment horsefish, so welcome to the horsefish club, I believe. Fun fact, this is the 3rd horsefish in Magic. Prove me wrong. It says whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turn, draw a card. There you go. That is the rare that you're looking for here. 3 mana, 2/2, whatever. That's going to die some amount of the time. But if this card survives and you're able to keep casting spells on your opponent's turn, whether they're counter spells, whether they're flash creatures, whether they're just removal spells, this card is just going to win you the game single-handedly by just out-card advantage in your opponent. Imagine every time you counter your opponent's spell with a Wavebreak Hippocamp on board, you counter their spell. It's basically like you're casting a cryptic command, right? You draw a card, counter a spell. That draws you into more action. Your opponent gets farther and farther behind. You just hold up 1 spell per turn every time your opponent goes, and you just counter whatever they do, or you react, and you get to outdraw them. It's a frail body. It's not a busted rare. It's a very fair card, in my opinion, but it is the type of card that can carry a game, and it's at its best in this blue-red archetype. And that's going to go ahead and do it for those first 2, blue, black, blue, red. Again, feel free to tell me in the comments below if this sort of format works for you when it comes to this archetype breakdown. I know, again, it's just me talking forever, but that's how we're going to go ahead and do it this time. Next time, I'll move away from some blue decks, and we'll move into some red decks and try to shift colors a little bit here. So we'll talk about green-red, which is the basically ferocious or 4 power matters archetype, and we'll talk about white-red, which is this set's riff off of heroic, and we'll kind of gather our minds with those 2 archetypes next time. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it's useful for you. We'll be back with those 2 color pairs next time, and remember to leave a comment below if this has been useful or if you have any feedback. Find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks, and as always, I appreciate you being here. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.